A stranger in the chair. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the quiet Sacramento streets, bathing the city in hues of orange and gold. Dr. Paul Riviere, a seasoned dentist with years of experience behind him, leaned against the doorway of his private practice. The converted Victorian home had seen better days, but its sturdy foundation and elegant wooden trims gave it a quiet dignity that mirrored his own demeanor. Paul exhaled deeply, rolling his shoulders as the last scheduled patient of the day exited with a grateful smile. "Thank you, Dr. Riviere," the elderly man said, running his tongue across his freshly cleaned teeth. "I always dread these visits, but you somehow make them bearable." Paul chuckled, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "That's the goal. Remember, floss daily, and we'll see you in 6 months." The door swung shut behind his patient, and Paul allowed himself a brief moment to revel in the silence of his empty waiting room. But that peace was short-lived. The glass front door swung open, and 2 figures stepped inside. A young woman and a man who, at first glance, appeared to be her boyfriend. Paul's well-trained instincts immediately sensed something was off. The woman, petite, delicate, with dark hair that cascaded over her shoulders, held an anxious posture. Her shoulders slumped, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her worn-out sweater. The man beside her, in contrast, moved with an air of dominance. His sharp features were set in a hard expression, his grip on the woman's arm just a little too firm, his stance possessive. Paul squinted slightly behind his glasses. Something about the couple triggered a quiet alarm in the back of his mind. Before he could ponder further, his receptionist, Diana, greeted them. "Welcome to Riviere Dental. Do you have an appointment?" The man's gaze flicked to Diana, cold and calculating. "Yeah," he said. "Mona Collins. First-time patient." Diana quickly checked the system, nodding. "Yes, Dr. Riviere can see you now. Please fill out these forms." Mona hesitated before taking the clipboard, her fingers trembling slightly as she filled in her details. Paul watched closely. Her name, her birthday, her medical history, or at least the version she was willing to disclose. When she finished, Diana took the clipboard, her practiced eye scanning the information before handing it over to Paul. He glanced at it briefly. Something caught his eye. Emergency contact. Amon Jackson. His gut twisted slightly, but he maintained a calm expression. "Miss Collins," he called out. Mona startled at the sound of his voice, but quickly nodded and stood up. The man beside her did the same. Paul offered a warm smile and gestured toward the exam room. "Come on in." The boyfriend took a step forward, too. "I need a chair," he said, his voice clipped. "I'm staying with her." Paul hesitated for only a second before motioning toward the farthest seat in the room. "You can sit there," he said evenly. Amon didn't look pleased, but he took the chair anyway, shifting it slightly closer to the examination table. Paul turned his attention to Mona, who was already perched on the dental chair, hands tightly gripping the armrests. "All right, Miss Collins," he said, keeping his voice gentle. "Let's take a look." He snapped on a pair of latex gloves, the familiar sterile scent of antiseptic filling the air. "Open wide for me." Mona hesitated for a fraction of a second before parting her lips. Paul inhaled sharply, his professional mask slipping for just a moment. She had no teeth. Where a full set of natural teeth should have been, there was only bare gum tissue. Red, swollen, raw, scattered throughout her mouth were small metal implants, signs of a previous attempt at restoration, but there were no actual prosthetics in place. Paul had seen many dental conditions in his time, but nothing like this. For a woman so young, she couldn't have been older than 25. It was beyond alarming. His fingers were steady as he inspected her mouth further, his mind racing with silent questions. "How did this happen?" he asked, carefully keeping his tone neutral. Mona's gaze darted toward Amon. He stared back at her with an unreadable expression. Paul noted the brief hesitation before she finally answered. I had a bad accident," she said, her voice slurred slightly due to the lack of teeth. Ice skating. Paul blinked. Ice skating. In an indoor rink, she added quickly. I slipped. Fell on my face. Paul had heard plenty of unlikely dental stories in his years of practice, but something about her answer didn't sit right. Sacramento wasn't exactly known for its ice skating rinks, and even if it had been an accident, total tooth loss from a single fall was rare. He kept his suspicions to himself for the moment, choosing instead to shift his focus back to her gums. These implants. He traced a gloved finger gently along the metal protrusions in her mouth. Where did you get them? Mona's body stiffened. She didn't look at him. A different dentist, she mumbled. Paul's brows furrowed. Why didn't you go back to them when the implants failed? Ammon, who had been eerily silent up until now, suddenly spoke. We didn't like their work, he said. His voice was sharp, clipped. They messed up. That's why we came here. Paul turned to him, meeting his gaze for the first time. Ammon's eyes were cold and flat. I understand, Paul said slowly, but implants don't just fall out unless there's significant trauma or... We don't need a lecture, Ammon interrupted, his jaw tightening. Can you fix it or not? Paul studied the man carefully before turning back to Mona. He softened his voice. Mona, do you have any pain? She nodded slightly. It hurts all the time. Paul exhaled, pushing down the unease curling in his gut. He had two options: either accept what they were telling him at face value, or trust his instincts that something much darker was at play. He chose the latter. All right, he said, removing his gloves. I can help, but it's going to take time. You'll need a full reconstruction. How much? Ammon demanded. Paul hesitated. At least $40,000 for a complete restoration. Ammon scoffed, shaking his head. Forget it. Mona flinched, barely perceptible, but Paul noticed. The room fell into a tense silence. Paul finally cleared his throat. If cost is an issue, there may be payment plans we can. Ammon stood up abruptly. We'll figure something else out, he snapped. Mona quickly climbed down from the chair, her head bowed. She was following him without question. Paul's heart pounded as he watched them leave. Every fiber of his being screamed that something was terribly wrong. As the door swung shut behind them, his hands curled into fists. Something wasn't right, and he wasn't going to ignore it. He made a split-second decision. Grabbing his jacket, he turned to Diana. Lock up when you're done, he instructed. Where are you going? She asked, frowning. Paul didn't answer. He was already heading out the door, and as he stepped onto the street, watching Ammon and Mona disappear into the evening, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't done with this yet. Following the shadows, Dr. Paul Riviere gripped the steering wheel of his car, his fingers tightening with each passing second as he trailed the dark sedan through the dimly lit streets of Sacramento. He had never done anything like this before, following a patient, acting like some amateur detective. It was reckless, possibly even dangerous. But something in his gut told him that if he didn't act now, Mona Collins might not get another chance. His headlights were off, the glow of the streetlights casting eerie shadows along the cracked pavement as he maintained a safe distance. The city had changed in the last few minutes. Gone were the well-maintained roads and welcoming storefronts. In their place were neglected buildings, flickering neon signs, and the unmistakable presence of figures lurking on street corners. Paul knew this part of the city. It was where the vulnerable ended up, where desperation festered, and where people like Mona were swallowed whole. Ahead, the black sedan rolled to a stop in front of a dingy-looking motel. The No VACANCWE sign buzzed erratically, casting a dull red glow over the parking lot. Paul parked his car a block away, far enough to stay unnoticed, but close enough to observe. He watched as Ammon climbed out first, adjusting his leather jacket, his posture radiating authority. Mona followed a second later, her shoulders hunched, her movements hesitant. Even from this distance, Paul could see the bruises along the curve of her jaw, partially hidden by her dark hair. Eamon grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the motel entrance. She didn't resist. Paul clenched his teeth. He should call the police. That was the logical move. But without evidence, what could he even say? That he had a feeling something was wrong. That his patient's story didn't add up. That wasn't enough to make an arrest. And if Eamon caught wind that Paul had gotten the police involved, Mona could disappear before help ever arrived. No, he had to be smart. Paul glanced around, looking for another way to gather information. That's when he saw her, a woman, leaning against the motel railing on the second floor, a cigarette dangling from her lips. Her leather miniskirt barely covered her thighs, her fishnet stockings riddled with holes. She watched the scene unfold below with practiced disinterest, flicking ashes over the railing before exhaling a long plume of smoke. Paul hesitated for only a moment before stepping out of his car. This was insane. He wasn't a cop. He wasn't a hero. He was just a dentist. But right now, he was Mona's only chance. He crossed the street, keeping his pace casual as he approached the woman. She noticed him immediately, her gaze sharp and assessing. "You lost, Doc?" she asked, her voice laced with amusement. Paul stiffened. He wasn't exactly dressed for this neighborhood. His button-down shirt and slacks screamed middle-class professional, making him stand out like a sore thumb. "I'm looking for some information," he said. She raised a perfectly shaped brow. "Oh yeah? What kind of information?" Paul pulled a folded $50 bill from his pocket, holding it up between his fingers. The woman's eyes flicked to it before she smirked. "Now you're speaking my language." She plucked the bill from his hand with practiced ease, tucking it into the lacy bra strap peeking out from under her jacket. Paul exhaled. The girl who just went inside. The one with the dark hair. "Mona, do you know her?" The woman scoffed. "Yeah, I know her. But I don't know if she wants to know you, Doc. I just want to make sure she's safe." At that, the woman let out a low, humorless laugh. "Safe? In this place?" She shook her head. "Mona's been here a while. She ain't here by choice. But that boyfriend of hers, he makes sure she stays." Paul's stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" The woman took another drag of her cigarette before exhaling through her nose. "He owns her. Simple as that. She don't leave unless he says so. And if she tries." She let the sentence hang in the air, but the implication was clear. Paul swallowed hard. Has she ever asked for help? "Wouldn't matter if she did," the woman said with a shrug. "Eamon's got eyes everywhere, and when he doesn't, he's got people who make sure she don't get any ideas about leaving." A chill ran down Paul's spine. He needed to get Mona out. But how? He wasn't armed. He had no backup. If Eamon caught him snooping around, this could go south. Fast. The woman must have seen the conflict in his expression because she sighed, crushing her cigarette under the heel of her boot. "Look, Doc, if you really want to help her, you better do it fast. Eamon's making plans. Word is, he's getting ready to move her out of state." Paul's breath caught. "When?" "Could be tonight. Could be tomorrow." She shrugged. "But once she's gone, and you'll never see her again." The words hit him like a gut punch. This was bigger than he thought. He needed a plan, and he needed one now. Paul pulled out his phone as soon as he was back in his car, his fingers shaking as he scrolled through his contacts. Rena. She was his best assistant. Smart. Resourceful. The only person who might actually believe him. He hit the call button. She picked up on the second ring. "Paul. What's up? Did you forget something at the office?" "No," he said, his voice tight. "Listen, I need your help. I'm in a bad part of town, outside a motel. One of my patients, Mona, she's in trouble. Serious trouble." There was a pause. Then, what kind of trouble? Paul hesitated, then decided there was no point in sugarcoating it. "I think she's being trafficked. and I think her boyfriend is about to move her across state lines. Rena let out a sharp breath. Jesus, Paul. I need proof, he said quickly. Something solid. Otherwise, the cops won't do anything. There was a brief silence before Rena spoke again. Okay, I have a friend. She works with victims of abuse. She knows how to get things moving when the police drag their feet. Paul's pulse quickened. You think she can help? She can at least tell us what to do, Rena said. Where are you now? Paul gave her the address. Be careful, she warned. This guy, if he's as dangerous as you think, you can't take any risks. I know, Paul said, gripping the wheel. He exhaled sharply. I can't let her disappear, Rena. A long pause. Then, softer, I know. They hung up. Paul leaned back in his seat, staring at the glowing No Vacancy sign. Somewhere inside that motel, Mona was trapped. But not for long. He would find a way. Even if it was the last thing he did. The trap is set. The motel loomed like a dying beast in the night, its flickering neon sign casting an eerie red glow over the cracked pavement. Dr. Paul Riviere sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel, his mind racing with possibilities. He had never imagined his day would end like this, lurking in the shadows, waiting for an opportunity to save a woman he barely knew. His phone buzzed. A message from Rena. Rena, I'm 5 minutes out. Got my friend, Maria, with me. She knows what to do. Sit tight. Paul exhaled, relief washing over him. Maria. That was the friend Rena mentioned, the one who worked with abuse survivors. If anyone could help get Mona out safely, it was her. His eyes flicked back to the motel entrance. Ammon had taken Mona inside nearly half an hour ago, and there had been no sign of movement since. Paul's fingers drummed against the dashboard. He had to do something. But what? Storming in would be reckless. Calling the cops without solid proof wouldn't guarantee anything. Then he saw her again, the woman from earlier, the one who had warned him. She was leaning against the motel's rusty railing, lighting another cigarette. Paul didn't think twice. He shoved his phone into his pocket, climbed out of his car, and made his way toward her. She noticed him immediately and smirked. Back already, Doc. Thought you'd be smarter than this. Paul ignored the jab. You said Amon's planning to move Mona soon. How do you know? The woman exhaled a stream of smoke, her dark eyes narrowing. I hear things. Paul folded his arms. You hear who's saying things. She chuckled. You ask a lot of questions for someone in the wrong neighborhood. Paul pulled out another bill. This time, a crisp 100. He held it between 2 fingers. You answer, you get this. Simple. The woman eyed the money, then snatched it. Amon's been making calls all night. He's got some kind of deal going down, and he needs to get rid of Mona before it happens. Paul frowned. A deal. The woman shrugged. I don't know details, but I do know this. He ain't keeping Mona around much longer. Either he's selling her off, or he's dumping her somewhere worse. Paul's blood ran cold. Dumping her. If Amon saw Mona as a liability, that meant she was in far more danger than he initially thought. His mind raced. He needed to act tonight. Then the woman spoke again. If you're gonna make a move, Doc, do it fast. I won't be the only one watching. Paul stiffened. What do you mean? She gestured subtly toward the street corner, where 2 men leaned against a beat-up sedan, their eyes locked on the motel. They weren't hotel guests. They weren't lost. They were watching, waiting. Paul's heart pounded. Ammon wasn't working alone. He had backup. Just then, a car pulled up behind Paul's. He turned to see Rena stepping out of the driver's side, her expression tense. Beside her, a woman with short-cropped black hair and a serious demeanor climbed out. Maria. She wasted no time, striding up to Paul. Rena told me everything, she said, her voice calm but firm. We don't have much time. What's the situation? Paul gestured to the motel. Mona's inside with Amon. He's planning to move her soon, maybe tonight. And now we've got them watching too. He nodded toward the two men on the corner. Maria followed his gaze and frowned. Traffickers, she murmured. They're not just watching. They're waiting. Paul swallowed hard. For what? For Amon to deliver. A weight settled on Paul's chest. It was worse than he feared. Mona wasn't just Amon's captive. She was merchandise. Maria turned back to him, her expression unreadable. You said she trusts you, at least a little. Paul hesitated. I think so. Good, because if we're going to get her out, we need her to come willingly. If she resists, it'll be 10 times harder to get her to safety. Paul ran a hand through his hair. And if Amon catches us first? Maria's eyes hardened. We make sure he doesn't. Paul glanced toward the motel. So what's the plan? Maria cracked her knuckles. We bait the trap. The plan in motion. They didn't have much time. Maria laid it out quickly. Paul would go inside and try to get Mona alone. Meanwhile, Maria and Rena would create a distraction outside. The goal was to lure Amon out of the motel, leaving Mona unguarded. And if things go sideways? Paul asked. Maria smiled grimly. Then I call in a favor with someone who can get the cops to move their asses. Paul exhaled. All right, let's do it. He squared his shoulders and walked toward the motel entrance. Every step felt heavier than the last. He pushed open the door, stepping into the dimly lit lobby. A tired-looking clerk barely glanced up from behind the desk. Need a room? Paul shook his head. Just here to visit a friend. The clerk grunted, uninterested, and returned to whatever cheap TV show he was watching. Paul moved down the hallway, his pulse pounding. Room 203. That's where they had gone. He reached the door and took a steadying breath before raising his fist and knocking. No answer. He knocked again, louder this time. Footsteps. Then the door creaked open an inch. Mona. She peered out cautiously, her expression shifting from fear to surprise when she saw him. Dr. Riviere, she whispered. What are you? Let me in, Paul said urgently. She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder. Paul could see the dimly lit motel room behind her. A single bed, clothes thrown carelessly on the floor, a TV playing low static in the background. Then another voice. Who's at the door? Amon. Mona's grip on the door tightened. You need to go, she whispered. Paul's heart pounded. Mona, listen to me. You don't have to stay here. I can help you. The door swung open violently. Amon stood there, his face twisted with anger. The hell do you think you're doing here, dentist? Paul barely had time to react before Amon grabbed him by the collar and yanked him into the room, slamming the door shut behind them. Paul stumbled, catching himself against the dresser. He turned just in time to see Amon reach for something under his jacket. A gun. Paul's breath caught in his throat. Amon grinned, tapping the weapon against his palm. You got some balls showing up here. That's a problem. Paul swallowed hard. He needed to stall. Needed to buy time. I just came to check on my patient, he said, keeping his voice level. Amon laughed. That's so. He took a slow step forward. See, I don't think you just came here for that. I think you're sticking your nose where it don't belong. Paul's brain raced. He needed to act fast. Then, bang. Not a gunshot. A loud explosion from outside. The motel lights flickered. Paul didn't hesitate. He lunged. He slammed his shoulder into Amon, knocking him off balance. The gun clattered to the floor. Mona, run, Paul shouted. She hesitated for a split second, then bolted. Amon cursed, shoving Paul aside. He lunged for the gun. Paul kicked it under the bed. Amon roared in frustration. Then, the sound of sirens. Amon's eyes widened. Paul's heart leaped. Maria's distraction had worked. The trap was set. Now, all they had to do was escape alive. A desperate escape. The room was a storm of chaos. The dim motel light flickered, casting erratic shadows across the walls as sirens blared in the distance. Dr. Paul Rivier's heart pounded in his ears as he struggled to regain his balance. Mona was already at the door, her breath shallow, eyes darting between Paul and Ammon. Ammon, however, was a different story, his face twisted in rage, veins bulging at his temples as he scrambled to reach under the bed, where the gun had landed just out of reach. Paul made a split-second decision. He charged. His body collided with Ammon's side, sending both of them crashing into the flimsy nightstand. A lamp shattered, glass exploding across the stained carpet as Ammon let out a pained grunt. "Mona, go," Paul shouted. Mona hesitated, just for a heartbeat. Then she turned and ran. Paul barely had time to process his relief before Ammon's fist slammed into his ribs. Pain exploded through Paul's side. He gasped, stumbling backward, clutching his torso. Ammon was stronger than he looked, dangerous, unpredictable. Ammon lunged for the gun again. Paul kicked it. The weapon slid further beneath the bed, out of reach. Ammon let out a string of curses. Then he turned his rage on Paul. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life, dentist." Paul barely had time to react before Ammon grabbed him by the collar and threw him against the motel dresser. His back slammed into the wood, the impact knocking the air from his lungs. The sirens outside grew louder. Ammon turned toward the window, eyes widening. The police were almost here. Paul saw his opening. With everything he had left, he swung. His fist connected with Ammon's jaw. The impact was brutal, sending the man stumbling backward. Paul didn't wait. He turned and ran. The chase begins. Paul burst through the motel room door, his pulse thundering. The hallway stretched before him, dimly lit and lined with peeling wallpaper. Where was Mona? Then he spotted her. She was already near the motel stairs, her body tense, her hands gripping the railing as if deciding whether to run or hide. "Mona," Paul called out. She turned, her eyes wide. "We have to go. Now." But before either of them could move, Ammon's roar erupted from behind them. Paul whirled around. Ammon was in the doorway, his face contorted with fury. He didn't have his gun, but his eyes were murderous. "Mona, get down," Paul ordered. Mona didn't hesitate. She dropped to the ground just as Ammon lunged. Paul barely dodged in time. Ammon's fist whizzed past his face, slamming into the motel wall with enough force to leave a dent in the drywall. Paul didn't wait for a second chance. He grabbed Mona's wrist and yanked her toward the stairs. They bolted. Mona's bare feet slapped against the cold pavement as they raced down the steps, her breath coming in quick, panicked gasps. The sirens were so close now. Paul could see the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the building. They just had to reach the street, just a few more steps. Then suddenly, a car screeched to a stop in front of them. Paul's heart nearly stopped. The sit-in, the same beat-up car that had been parked outside earlier. And inside, two men, waiting. Their doors swung open. Paul's gut clenched. Ammon's backup. They weren't just watching. They were here to take Mona. One of the men, a thick-necked brute with a jagged scar running down his cheek, stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. "Come on, girl," he said, voice low and menacing. "You know better than to run." Mona froze. Her whole body locked up, her breath hitching as she stared at them. Paul could feel her terror. The second man reached for something in his jacket. Paul didn't stick around to find out what. "Run," he yelled, shoving Mona forward. She snapped out of it, her legs propelling her into motion. Paul followed, but the men were already closing in. Then, a voice cut through the chaos. "Freeze. Hands up." A spotlight blinded them. The cops. The officers had arrived, and they were armed. The men near the sit-in stiffened, caught off guard. The officer closest to them, a tall, grizzled veteran with his gun drawn, took a step closer. On the ground, now, The two men hesitated. Then they ran. They scrambled back into the car, the tires squealing as the driver floored it. Suspects fleeing northbound on Oak Street, requesting pursuit. An officer barked into his radio. More sirens blared in response. Paul barely had time to process it all before a firm hand landed on his shoulder. "Sir, are you injured?" Paul turned, his breath still coming in ragged gasps. The officer gripping his shoulder looked calm but alert. I'm fine," Paul managed. "She's the one who needs help." He turned toward Mona. She was still standing a few feet away, her arms wrapped around herself, trembling. But she was free. The realization hit Paul like a punch to the chest. She was free. Aman was gone. His men were fleeing. She wasn't trapped anymore. A second officer approached Mona carefully, his tone gentle. "Miss, are you all right?" Mona blinked at him, as if struggling to comprehend the words. Slowly, she nodded. "I think." Her voice was small, fragile. "I think I'm okay." Paul exhaled deeply, relief flooding through him. The officer looked between them. "We're going to need statements from both of you. And miss, we'd like to get you somewhere safe." Mona hesitated. Then, finally, she looked up at Paul. Her lips parted, just slightly. "Can I go with him?" she asked quietly. Paul's breath caught. The officer studied him for a moment, then nodded. "We'll need to process things at the station first. But after that, if you trust him." "Yes." Mona looked at Paul again. And this time, there was something new in her eyes. Something he hadn't seen before. Hope. A new beginning. 2 hours later, Paul sat beside Mona in a dimly lit police station, a styrofoam cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. Mona had just finished giving her statement, her fingers curled tightly around the blanket an officer had given her. "You did good," Paul murmured. Mona turned toward him, her expression unreadable. "I don't know what happens now," she admitted. "I don't even know where I go from here." Paul set his coffee down. "I have an idea," he said. "It won't fix everything. But it's a start." Mona frowned. "What do you mean?" Paul took a breath. "I'm offering to help you," he said. "You need medical care. You need a fresh start. I can help with that." Mona stared at him. Her eyes flickered with something unspoken. Then, finally, she nodded. A small, hesitant nod. But a nod nonetheless. Paul exhaled. It wasn't over. There was still a long road ahead. But Mona wasn't alone anymore. And for the first time in years, she had a way out. A fragile hope. The morning sun filtered through the large glass windows of Rivier Dental, casting golden streaks across the pristine white floor. The smell of antiseptic and mint lingered in the air, a sharp contrast to the chaotic events of the night before. Dr. Paul Rivier stood near the reception desk, flipping through a patient file, though his mind wasn't focused on the words in front of him. His body ached from last night's altercation, his ribs bruised, his knuckles still raw from his desperate fight with Ammon. But none of that mattered. Mona was safe. That was the only thing that mattered. A gentle ding from the front door broke his trance. Paul turned just in time to see Mona Collins step inside. She looked different. No longer trapped in the provocative clothing Ammon had forced upon her, she wore an oversized sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. There were still shadows beneath her eyes, the ghosts of sleepless nights and years of suffering, but something had changed. Her posture was a little straighter. Her eyes, though cautious, were no longer clouded with despair. She was here, and she had made the decision to come on her own. Paul exhaled the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Hey," he greeted softly. Mona's fingers curled around the strap of the worn-out purse slung over her shoulder. She glanced around the clinic, her lips pressing together. "I wasn't sure if I should come," she admitted. I don't really know what to say." Paul offered her a reassuring smile. "You don't have to say anything," he said. "You're here. That's enough." Mona hesitated, then nodded. Rena, who had been pretending not to eavesdrop from behind the counter, cleared her throat, and stepped forward. "I'll take her to the exam room," she said, smiling at Mona. "Come on, I'll show you where to go." Mona followed her without a word, her steps hesitant but determined. Paul watched her disappear down the hallway. This was the beginning, and he would do everything in his power to make sure she didn't regret taking this step. Unraveling the truth. The bright exam light hummed softly overhead as Paul adjusted his gloves. Mona sat in the reclining dental chair, hands gripping the armrests tightly. She was nervous. Paul could see it in the way she held herself, the slight tremble in her fingers, the way her gaze flickered to the door every few seconds, as if expecting Ammon to come bursting through. "He's gone," Paul said gently. "He's in custody. He can't hurt you anymore." Mona flinched at the mention of Ammon's name. She forced a nod, but didn't say anything. Paul knew he had to tread carefully. He grabbed his sterilized equipment and sat down beside her. "All right," he said, keeping his tone calm. "I'm going to take a closer look at your gums and implants. If anything hurts, just let me know." Mona hesitated, then gave a small nod. Paul leaned in, his trained eyes scanning the inside of her mouth. It was worse than he had initially thought. The metal implants, meant to serve as anchors for prosthetic teeth, were damaged, corroded, and infected. The gum tissue was swollen and raw, inflamed from what looked like weeks of neglect and improper care. Paul clenched his jaw. Whoever had done this work had been either incompetent or cruel, possibly both. He pulled back, his brows furrowing. "Mona," he said carefully, "who put these implants in?" She stiffened. I don't know," she murmured. Paul studied her. "Mona." He pressed, his voice gentle. "I need to know who did this. It could help me fix it." Mona's fingers curled into fists. Her breathing quickened. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then, finally, "It wasn't a dentist." Paul's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" he asked. Mona swallowed hard. "It was Ammon's people," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He wouldn't let me see a real dentist, said it was too expensive. So he had someone else do it." Paul's stomach twisted. Illegal dental work, done by unlicensed criminals. It wasn't unheard of. Desperate people, those without access to proper health care, often resorted to back-alley procedures. But for Ammon to force this on her, Paul gritted his teeth. Mona must have noticed his reaction because she quickly continued, her voice laced with shame. They did it in some basement. It was dirty. They didn't use the right equipment. I was awake the whole time." Paul's hands clenched into fists. God. She had suffered through that. He forced himself to exhale slowly, keeping his expression neutral. He didn't want to scare her with his anger. "Okay," he said, his voice measured. "Thank you for telling me." Mona looked down, her fingers twisting together. "Can it be fixed?" Paul softened. "Yes," he said firmly. "But it's going to take time." Mona nodded slowly. I don't have money." "I told you," Paul said. "I'm doing this for free." Her head snapped up, eyes wide with disbelief. "Why?" Paul hesitated for only a second before answering. "Because I can." Because she deserved it. Because she had already suffered enough. Mona's lip trembled. She blinked rapidly and turned her gaze away. But not before Paul saw the glimmer of tears in her eyes. The first step toward healing. Over the next hour, Paul carefully examined every inch of Mona's mouth, taking x-rays, making notes, planning the best way to undo the damage. As he worked, Mona gradually relaxed. She still flinched whenever he moved too quickly, still tensed whenever he touched her face. But she didn't stop him. That was progress. Finally, Paul pulled off his gloves, leaning back with a sigh. "Well," he said, offering her a small smile, "you're going to need a full restoration. It won't be easy, and it won't be quick, but I can help." Mona swallowed. "And when you fix it?" she asked hesitantly. "Will I?" Will I be normal again? Paul's expression softened. You were never not normal, Mona. She blinked at him. You've been through hell, Paul continued, but you're still here. That says a lot about you. Mona's throat bobbed as she swallowed. For a moment, she didn't speak. Then, very softly, she whispered, "Thank you." Paul nodded. "We'll take it one step at a time," he promised. Mona gave a small, hesitant nod in return. It wasn't a perfect resolution. It wasn't a grand, dramatic moment. But it was something. And sometimes, something was enough. A shadow in the distance. As the day wound down, Mona lingered in the waiting area, sipping the tea Rena had given her. Paul watched from his office door, a sense of cautious relief settling in his chest. She was safe. For now. But just as he was about to return to his paperwork, something caught his eye. A figure, standing across the street. A man. Watching. Paul's breath hitched. It wasn't Ammon. He was locked up. But someone else was out there. Paul's jaw clenched. He wasn't done protecting Mona. Not yet. And whatever threat was lurking in the distance, he'd be ready for it. The shadow that lingers. The sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows across Riviere Dental's waiting area. The warm golden light did little to calm the storm brewing in Dr. Paul Riviere's mind. He stood at his office doorway, his gaze locked on the figure across the street. A man, partially obscured by the lamplight, standing motionless, watching. Paul's gut twisted. Who was he? Not Ammon. That much was certain. Ammon was in custody, likely facing years behind bars for illegal possession of a firearm and suspected human trafficking. But Ammon had friends, and judging by the way this man was lingering, those friends weren't ready to let Mona go. Paul inhaled deeply, forcing himself to stay calm. He turned his attention back to Mona, who sat curled up in a waiting room chair, gripping a warm cup of tea in her trembling hands. She had no idea. No idea that someone was watching her. No idea that danger was still lurking just beyond the glass doors of the clinic. Paul needed to act, and fast. But how? He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against his phone. He could call the police, report a suspicious person loitering outside his clinic. But would that be enough? What if the man was just a lookout? Paul clenched his jaw. This wasn't over. Not yet. A safe place isn't always safe. Paul walked into the waiting area, his expression carefully neutral. "Mona," he said gently. She looked up, her fingers tightening around her cup. "It's getting late," he continued. "You need a safe place to stay tonight." Mona hesitated. She knew it too. For all her bravery in escaping Ammon, she wasn't truly free yet. She licked her lips, hesitating. I have nowhere to go." Paul exhaled, nodding as if he had already expected that answer. "You can stay in a shelter," he said. "Rena has a friend who works with abuse survivors. She can help you." Mona's body stiffened at the word shelter. "No," she said quickly, shaking her head. Paul frowned. "Why not?" Mona looked down at her tea. "They'll find me. Ammon had connections everywhere. He always said he could track me down if I ran. Shelters, they're too obvious." Paul's stomach tightened. She wasn't wrong. If Ammon had any remaining allies on the outside, they could easily track her to a local women's shelter. She needed somewhere Ammon's people wouldn't expect her to go. Paul rubbed his chin, thinking. Then it hit him. My place. Mona's eyes snapped to him, widening in shock. What? Paul nodded. You need somewhere they won't think to look for you. My house is private, outside the city, and secure. Mona shook her head quickly, looking terrified by the idea. I can't impose like that. You've already done so much for me. Paul leaned forward. Mona, he said, his voice steady. I know you're scared, and I know you don't trust many people right now, but I promise you, you're safe with me. Mona hesitated. A long silence stretched between them. Then, finally, she nodded. "Okay," she whispered. Paul exhaled, relief flooding his chest. "All right," he said. "Let's go." The drive into the unknown. The drive to Paul's house was silent, save for the occasional hum of passing cars. Mona sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window. Paul glanced at her every so often, watching her fingers tap anxiously against her thigh. "You're safe," he reassured her. Mona gave a small nod, but she didn't look convinced. Paul understood. How could she trust anyone after what she'd been through? His house wasn't far, just outside the city, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. The moment he pulled into his driveway, Mona hesitated, gripping the car door handle as if unsure whether to step out. Paul turned to her. "You don't have to be afraid here." She let out a shaky breath and nodded. Slowly, she stepped out. A place to breathe. Paul's house was warm, well-lit, and smelled faintly of coffee and cinnamon. It was a stark contrast to the cold, sterile environment of the clinic. Mona stepped inside hesitantly, taking in the cozy space. Bookshelves lined the walls, a fireplace crackled in the corner, and soft music played from a record player. She shifted uncomfortably. "This is nice." Paul smiled. "It's not much, but it's home." Mona hugged herself. Paul hesitated before speaking. "There's a guest room upstairs. You can stay there as long as you need." Mona swallowed. "I won't be here long. Just until I figure out what to do next." Paul nodded. "That's fine." He could tell she didn't fully believe it. She still felt like a burden. But Paul had no intention of letting her go back to the streets, or worse, back to Amon's world. "Get some rest," he said softly. "We'll talk more tomorrow." Mona nodded, though her eyes still held lingering fear. Paul knew it would take time before she truly believed she was free. But he was willing to wait. The darkness still watches. Later that night, Paul sat in his dimly lit living room, nursing a glass of water. His thoughts were heavy. Mona was safe. But for how long? He had seen the man watching from across the street. He hadn't imagined it. Amon might have been locked up, but his shadow still lingered. Paul pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts. Then he made a call. A few rings later, a voice answered. "Detective Larson," the voice grunted. "Who's this?" "This is Dr. Paul Riviere," Paul said. "We spoke about Mona Collins." A pause. Then, "Yeah, what's going on?" Paul inhaled sharply. "I think someone's watching her." The detective cursed under his breath. "Damn it. We figured Amon had more people on the outside." "You sure?" "Positive," Paul said. Larson sighed. "All right, I'll look into it. Keep an eye on her, and if anything feels off, call me. We'll put a unit on patrol near your house." Paul nodded, gripping his phone tightly. "Thanks, Detective." "Stay safe, Doc." The line went dead. Paul stared at his phone for a long time. Then he turned his gaze toward the darkened window. Outside, the street was quiet. Too quiet. Somewhere out there, someone was still watching. Waiting. Paul exhaled, a new determination settling in his chest. They weren't going to take Mona back. Not now. Not ever. And if they tried, they'd have to go through him first.